Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday Forum. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today we have an outstanding guest who is working on the edges of the possible, identifying the islands of coherence and mapping out ways we can evolve from where we are today to an eco-civilization. Jeremy Lent has been described by the Guardian's George Monbiot as one of the greatest thinkers of our age. He is the author of the award-winning The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, and The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. Jeremy's latest book, which was published 3 days ago, is Eco-Civilization: Making a World That Works for All. It doesn't merely diagnose what's broken. It reveals how our current civilization, designed for exploitation, accumulation, and elite power, is functioning exactly as it was intended. In its place, eco-civilization charts a radical yet feasible alternative. Lent's book is a call to imagine and build a better future on a regenerated Earth. This is the information we all need in co-creating a radical, ethical, informed, and compassionate system for the 21st century. Jeremy was born in London, England, and holds a BA in English Literature from Cambridge University and an MA from the University of Chicago. He is the founder of the nonprofit Leology Institute, which is dedicated to fostering an integrated worldview that could enable humanity to thrive sustainably on the earth. So welcome, Jeremy. It's wonderful to have you with us today. It's a real treat.
Oh, thank you, Georgia. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, I've got a whole bunch of questions. And for those of you who haven't been on one of our forums before, what we usually do is have a half hour of interview with my questions, and then we open it up to the audience to ask questions or make comments. I may go a little bit longer today because I know I'm the only one on the call that's read the whole book. And I've got lots of questions, but obviously we won't get to them all. So I want to actually begin, Jeremy, with something that you talked about, a very interesting figure, the Wendigo, I think it's called,
Uh-huh.
which is a figure in the Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region and their mythology. And this is an insatiable, ravenous being, which I think the diagnosis of the world we live in is really describes where we are today. So I'd like you to explain this mythical figure first. And then I'd like maybe to couple it with what I consider our cultural default mechanism, which is that we always seem to revert to control by a powerful elite. No matter how we seem to think we get past it, we end up back into it. And this elite controls our politics, our economics, our education. So it seems like these two forces, the Wendigo and the cultural default mechanism, reinforce each other in ways that it's very hard to push through with a systemic evolutionary change. So I'd like your thoughts on that and the combination
Yeah.
of those two.
Yeah. And it's interesting to sort of put those two together. And yeah, so that this Wendigo monster, it was a concept I came across actually in Robin Wall Kimmerer's great book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that I'm sure many people have read and enjoyed. And for people who don't know, she is an indigenous Native American biologist. And so she actually brings together this sort of deep indigenous understanding with biology and just great insights. But so she describes this mythical creature in her book. And as soon as I came across that, it just struck me like, wow, this is such an incredible metaphor for our entire civilization. And the thing about this creature, so they the kids would get scared around the campfire at night hearing about this creature. It was this creature with a heart of ice. But the thing about it, that it wasn't just ravenous, but it would try to eat as much as it could. But the more it ate, the more hungry it became. So that was one terrifying thing about it. But then, as soon as it bit you, if you were a regular person, you became infected by it and you became a Wendigo yourself. And then you became ravenous and always trying to eat more and never ending like that. So when when the Ojibwe people came across the Westerners coming and just having this ravenous need, like, give me more furs. The more furs they'd bring, the more they'd want. Oh, there's silver there. The more they'd find, the more like crazy they'd go for to find more. They began to say, well, it's almost like these people have been like bitten by the Wendigo virus. So you can take that concept and apply it worldwide, and really, it gives you this notion of what our dominant system has been about ever since really the rise of capitalism, colonialism, the limited liability corporation. All these things happened at the same time in early modern Europe around the 17th century. And it's literally that description of the more you eat, the more ravenous you become. It could not be better description than a shareholder-owned company right now. Like you could have a company, a publicly owned company, do great, make tons of money, and give dividends to your shareholders. All they care about is not what they just got in dividends, but what are your expected growth in earnings, what they call the PE ratio, in the next 10 to 20 years. And that's what analysts study. And that will determine your stock price, not what you've actually accomplished. So that's it, almost exactly. In fact, the more money you make that year, the more you've raised the bar to then increase it further. And this is exactly what modern corporations have experienced. And that's why you have the world we live in today, where big ag or big tech or big pharma are always looking for ways. How do we manipulate more? How do we extract more? How do we exploit more in order to find further ways to keep increasing our earnings? So that's kind of, and in fact, I call it in the book Wendigo Incorporated. And in fact, there's even a Wendigo's law that comes from that. Like some people might have heard of this um, paradox that was developed by a 19th century British economist called Jevons, who was totally flummoxed because he was looking at the steam engine, the creation by James Watt of the steam engine. And the reason James Watt initially created the steam engine was actually to simply find a more efficient way to pump water out of the coal mines so they could mine the coal more easily. So technically, and here was the paradox, technically, that should have led to less use of coal because now you had a more efficient way to pump the steam out. So you didn't need as much coal to do that. And yet the paradox was suddenly the coal mining like massively increased. And that paradox has been shown to be true for basically every technological improvement about for every material. And there's been studies over centuries looking at that and showing that's true. The only ones it's not true about are things like asbestos or things that have been put out of the system because they're poisonous or have been decided that they can't be used. So, and I've called that in the book Wendigo's law, because that's the reason why things like green growth or whatever simply as a myth because of that reason. So anyway, that's the kind of the Wendigo concept, which really infiltrates the book. But then your other point, Georgia, is about really what also essentially I call the wealth pump, which is essentially, and it's not my term,
So
that's something that has
fantasy.
has been developed by other theorists, but it's an incredibly powerful term. It's the idea the whole system is designed to suck wealth, that extraction exploitation, that Wendigo exploitation, to suck it for a tiny elite at the expense of everyone else. And that's we can trace back way beyond capitalism. Really, you can trace that back all the way to the beginning of empire and early civilizations, I think.
Yeah, that brings me to another thing. I was going to go to an idea that I'll actually delay later because I think following on what you just said, any authentic consideration of an eco-civilization must really begin with an accounting of the inequities that brought us to where we are today.
Yes.
And we need to confront head on this history that we didn't learn in school, that we
Hmm.
don't, it's our mythology just kind of leaves that out. So even though we live in an information age, a lot of the information is completely lacking in depth and in any rigor that really looks deeply at anything. And I wanted to just maybe spend a minute or so on the brutality of the European wars of conquest and colonization because I think they're a great case in point. You mentioned the Opium Wars and the treacherous conquest of South America. I mean, the really treachery in a lot of the relationships with the natives in South America. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that treachery, and how what we're up against that kind of history and what that
Yeah.
means for where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, and to your point, Georgie, the actually a big chapter in the book, an early chapter is called literally "The History They Didn't Teach You at School,"
Mhm.
and they don't teach you that at school in the West because it is so absolutely horrendous, and it's a history of utter shame that, and it goes all the way back from to the enclosure movements in early modern Europe, it's particularly in England, but other parts of Europe, starting in like the 15th century. But it was really with colonialism that it gets so extreme. And essentially, it's what is kind of mind-blowing is the way in which there's absolutely no moral compunction that these conquistadors and the colonialists and the imperialists used. I mean, they a part of the sort of worldview that arose there, like as I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, the notion of seeing nature as a machine, and as all came along with the scientific revolution. But along with that was seeing other people who were not white Christian males, essentially from Europe, as really subhuman. And it's this notion of, along with human supremacy, came white supremacy. And it is abysmal because that white supremacy really led to this sense that it was not only okay to actually utterly torture and mercilessly destroy, commit genocide against other people who were not white European Christian males, but it was actually God's destiny. It was like the right thing to do because they didn't, believe in Christianity. So the missionaries would go out to North and South America, and they'd read this legalized statement in Spanish or Portuguese to the indigenous people who didn't know a word what they were saying. Who basically said, if you do not bow down right now and pay obeisance forever to the emperor of the king of Spain, then you will be considered traitors, and we have the right to murder you and do what we want. And they'd be like sitting there laughing. Then the Spanish would come and start killing them. And basically, that was considered law. So then, and it really, one of the things I look in the book is the very notion of what we call law and law and order. And we think that there is something intrinsically good about law, and even if the laws need to be changed, law itself is good. What we discover is that what we call law is actually essentially the rules used by the conquering parties who basically conquered the peasants in Europe or then conquered other nations through colonialism, and they imposed essentially their their form of like we won, so we get to set the rules for how we maintain and own the basic treasures, and it happened everywhere. So I mean, some of the most horrendous stories were the British in India, where they would sort of go in, they'd betray, they'd take advantage of one principality fighting against the other, betray them, bring their forces in, and quite literally like sack an entire palace. And they were so proud of it. They would just take all the treasures, put them in barges down the river, and float like 30, 40, like a convoy of all these barges down to the ports, ship it back to England, and rejoice. And those are the very jewels that the English monarchs now have in their crown jewels, and all the stuff is basically stolen uh, blatantly from India and other countries in that way. And then, like basically the British became like uh, opium uh, um, basically
Dealers.
salespeople, exactly, dealers, essentially forcing the Chinese to allow them to basically addict millions upon millions of Chinese so that they could essentially sell their opium. They could make enough money to then buy from the Chinese the goods the Chinese didn't want to sell them for any other reason. So everywhere you go, it was so absolutely abysmal. And probably the worst of it all was Potosi, the silver. I mean, this is like Wendigo, the Wendigo monster at its most extreme. It was basically a mountain of silver that when they discovered it, they would go out and enslave indigenous people from uh, miles and miles, hundreds of miles away, bring them in, poison them with mercury. So each person lasted maybe a few months or a few years at most, and just basically dying on the streets with mercury poisoning. They'd bring in more and more. It's estimated as many as like 10 million people had died untimely deaths in this one place of Potosi. And what they stole, the amount of silver that they stole from South America was so massive that right now, if all that silver had been just invested at normal rates of return from that time to the present day, I've I've got the number somewhere, but it's something like hundreds of trillions of dollars. It's basically a huge amount of global wealth today. Was literally the silver that got stolen and then used to invest in things like the Industrial Revolution and everything else that I got the number here, $165 trillion dollars. That's basically one third of the world's total private wealth is what got stolen out of just the silver from South America. So these are the kind of things that once we realize that it's not a surprise that the majority of people in the majority world now are living lives of such desperation, and the gap between the global north and the majority world is even greater than it's ever been before, because then capital just builds more capital. Um, and so one of the key messages that comes out of this first section of the book is really just one simple statement. Like, many of us and so many well-intentioned groups and people around the world basically look at the system and say, the system's broken. We've got to fix it. Here's a flaw. Let's work on that. Let's, change this, fix that. And the big message of the book is actually no, the system isn't broken, which is first like, what are you talking about? The system is doing exactly what it was intended to do. It's a system to extract, to exploit, and to maximize and make more and more efficient, ever more efficient, the wealth pump, sucking wealth to tiny elites. And honestly, that system has never been more successful than it is today. That's why we need to change the system itself, not just try to fix a few things.
Excellent, excellent answer. I want to mention your book again, Eco Civilization, because it's one of the most extraordinary books I've ever read, and I highly recommend everybody who sees this get the book and really study it. It's a book to study, not just read through. I want to go to something that you mentioned at the beginning of the book because I think it's an interesting exercise. You called it backcasting.
Hmm.
And I found this to be a very useful concept. And I'd like you to talk about it, how this type of visioning can
Hmm.
help us get beyond the confines of the overtone window that we are enmeshed in right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's incredibly important. In a way, the book itself, the entire book, is an exercise in backcasting. And it's a very important concept because it really gets at the very notion of realistic. A lot of the time, as I've been launching the book, I've been, talking sometimes with podcasters and interviewers who come more from a mainstream kind of way of thinking. And, one of the questions they ask, well, this all sounds great, but how realistic is it? Come on. So it comes to this point. And the first element around that is to say, well, what is backcasting? Basically, backcasting is to look at a kind of future that we actually want, a future that is desirable, which in the point of an eco-civilization, over the years, I tried to distill it into a simple sentence that kind of encapsulates it really, which is like a world that sets the conditions for all beings to thrive on a regenerating earth. Now, just to be clear, that's not saying all beings will necessarily inevitably thrive, but it sets the conditions for all beings to then have the ability to then discover their own path of flourishing, like what Aristotle called eudaimonia, like find their own path to really fulfill themselves. So that's the basically, and all beings, by the way, does not just apply to all human beings, but all the beings that we share the living earth with. So that's what we want to get to. Now, of course, we're a long way away from that now. So what backcasting does is, okay, now we know we want to get there. well, what are the steps? What's a pathway that can then begin to lead us from where we are now to there? And now backcasting is a proven methodology that works in corporate America or other places. Like, company says, okay, we want to take over this industry. And our goal is to be, number one market share in this industry 10 years from now. How do we get there? So it's a recognized thing. It's not like some idealistic utopian kind of idea. Um, but that is fundamentally different from the kind of way in which planning usually works, where what we say is like, well, what's realistic? I mean, we look at how extreme wealth disparities are right now. Well, we're not going to stop Elon Musk from becoming a trillionaire. We can't do it. So what can we do? Well, maybe we can, start to create some idea of a wealth tax. Maybe we can get countries to pass some idea that maybe we'll have a 1% wealth tax or something, at least get something. I mean, that might be realistic. Even that is a huge jump from where we are now, but that's something that people might go for. Well, that might be, or else what's realistic? Let's try to stop or try to reduce the fossil fuel subsidies, the trillions of dollars that get given to the fossil fuel companies in order to destroy our world. Or so that's maybe realistic to try to do that. But these are the things that we've been doing for decades. And these are the things that we now are on a system that is careening at a faster and faster rate to the precipice. So to think that it's realistic to actually do this stuff and think we'll ever have a long-term future that's viable, that is, that famous quote from Einstein, even though it's attributed to Einstein, but I don't think it actually is Einstein. But a definition of insanity is to do something, see it doesn't work, and then keep doing it again and again and again, kind of thing. Um, and so that's the point. Like, what is realistic is to actually start off from what's possible or what we need to do, and then look at what's possible to get there. And so that's the basic structure of the book.
And then, of course, the next thing that would follow on that are what you write about the islands of coherence. There are places already where they are moving toward an eco-civilization much faster than we are here in the US. And they're usually smaller areas, but they've done some incredible work. And of course, the Mondragon Cooperatives in the
Hmm.
Basque region is one area.
Hmm.
Bologna and the Reggio Emilia region in Italy is another, Barcelona,
Exactly.
Montevideo. So there are lots of different
Exactly.
islands of coherence. And I'd like maybe to have you talk maybe about one or two of them and what has most inspired you about the ones you're going to
Yeah.
talk about.
Yeah, and all great credit to you, Georgia, for focusing so much attention. And I think the first time I ever came across Mondragon was through you. And and quite honestly, when I'm talking to like more mainstream interview podcasts and they ask for items of coherence, Mondragon's usually the very first example I give because
Mhm.
it's so compelling and it speaks to what people but then everyone knows, oh, we need these big corporations to make the world work. Well, they don't need to be shareholder-owned corporations, and they can be so effective. So, I mean, it's great. So that's super important to focus on that. And like you say, the Emilia-Romagna region, which shows it's not just one shining emblem of a company, but actually a whole region that can work. But there's all kinds of different islands of coherence around the world that all doing amazing things in different ways. We can think of islands of coherence in a way, basically just to give them a definition, if you will, are sort of groups of people who either by the way they live or the way they work or a combination of both, are essentially living according to the principles of that ecological civilization um, and are prefiguring it. So you can the way that I always look at a group and say, is that an island of coherence? I try to imagine that was scaled up and there were like tens of thousands or millions of this kind of group all around the world. Would it look like an eco-civilization? And if the answer is yes, then you know that's an island of coherence, basically. So some of them are indigenous based. A great example is the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance, known as ASHA. And some people here may know Atosa Sultani, who's been very involved in helping that to build. And that's just an amazing group that basically covers a number of different countries like Ecuador and Peru. And it's an indigenous-based group that has developed their own 30-year plan to kick fossil. It's saying we don't want fossil fuel companies in our land, and they're developing a self-organized process. Many different indigenous groups working together to essentially create themselves as a bioregion. And they're now beginning to get some meaningful funding from other groups in the global north to help them to achieve what they want to do. Then there's commons-based um, groups. And I don't know if some of you know the work of David Bollier, who's one of the leading thinkers of the commons. And he's studied, there's tons of examples come from his work. To give you one simple example is Buurtzorg, which is a healthcare a group, if you will. I was going to say company, but it's really more like a healthcare group in the Netherlands. What Buurtzorg stands for is neighborhood care. And it's kind of reinvented the idea of home care. So there's basically something like 14,000 nurses throughout the Netherlands who work really according to a commons-based structure. They've got autonomous teams that plan their own schedules, manage their own training, pull their knowledge. And what's crucial is rather than trying to make a ton of money, they're trying to actually give the best quality healthcare to the people who need it. And it's a little bit like the opposite of the Jevons paradox. There's like Buurtzorg paradox, if you will, which is that because they're trying to spend more time with people and actually really care for them rather than try to make a profit, there's a lower overall cost in the system and something like a 30% reduction in emergency room visits, and the client satisfaction is far higher than than with other providers because they're actually doing what they care about rather than trying to sort of make money out of a system. And another example is Wikipedia. Again, it's a commons-based way of organizing. So instead of this sort of for-profit AI type thing, it's trying to suck up basically really the greatest enclosure maybe ever in history. AI trying to like suck the entire wealth of human knowledge to be owned and employed by just a tiny group of privately owned companies that then everyone goes to get their information. Wikipedia was the opposite. It was saying, let's all self-organize together. And it really follows kind of principles, almost like the way termites self-organize
Mhm.
and create some of the most complex constructions anywhere in the world through what's known as stigmergy, where you do what you do, you leave a trace. In the case of a termite, it's like a hormone. In case of Wikipedia, something, it's like some notes as to what you've accomplished. Somebody else comes along, works on that, builds something else. Somebody critiques that and changes their mind. And together, you create this incredible, one of the greatest knowledge constructions humanity has ever seen. It's not owned by anybody. It's basically belongs to us all. These are the ideas. And so what you can see from that is that these islands of coherence are not one particular kind. They're not like all permaculture, intentional communities, which themselves are wonderful, not to kind of sniff at that, but they're everywhere around us. Once you start to look at them, you realize, they're there in your own neighborhoods, probably, once you begin to see these islands of coherence. And the notion is that as this dominant system unravels, it's a little bit like that Buckminster Fuller quote that I'm sure many people know, like, don't try to fight the old system, but let's build a new system within it. So as the old one unravels, that's there for everyone. And that's basically what those islands of coherence can be doing. But they're facing the headwinds of the dominant culture. And that's why it's so important for us to basically kind of help to organize, to amplify, to augment them, basically, help them to learn from each other, and help to get resources to them because they're not, the whole system is designed basically to destroy them, to undermine them.
Now, I want to mention another island of coherence that doesn't exist any longer, but it was never in our history books. And this was the city-state of Dubrovnik, which was called
Uh,
Ragusa at that time. But it was a city-state for 600 years that never went to war, when it was
mm,
surrounded by other city-states, Venice, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, that did engage in war. And they managed to avoid it for the 600 years they
wow.
existed. And that is such an island of coherence that we never learn anything about.
Mhm.
And years ago, I came to the conclusion the reason why we don't learn about it is they didn't conquer anybody, they didn't grab more territory, they didn't do any of, and they had no heroes. So they didn't do any of the things that Western civilization put on pedestals. They were just not
Yeah,
seen. They were
that
invisible.
is so interesting, Georgia. And let me just kind of build on that for a
Sure.
moment, because just to kind of expand that back into history around civilizations, because one of the questions is sometimes when talk about ecological civilization, people say that's the wrong word, civilization. I mean, look what civilization itself is like empire and monuments and basically the wealth pump. And that's mostly true for most civilizations. But there was the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley, which existed for thousands of years. Um, but we know almost nothing about it, even though it was huge and very extensive. Um, and it's just like Dubrovnik, what you were describing. It had no big monuments. And when the archaeology that has been done for it have noticed that they basically had this incredibly broad street network that went on. It was like a standardized road network and went on and on for miles and miles and miles and square miles. And it was standardized. And basically, you could be 25 miles out in the periphery, and it looked like you had the same living spaces, the same standard and quality of life that you had when you were in the center of it. So basically, it was quite possibly the world's only significant, huge, very major civilization that lasted for thousands of years that actually did not work according to that wealth pump. And we know almost nothing about it, just again, like it's invisible.
And these are the things we need to actually dig up this history,
Yeah.
teach this history, and so that people realize we're not just one kind of creature. We have
Yeah.
other possibilities. I have too many questions, and I'm going to try and, at this point, ask one more and possibly just have you comment on something else at the end. But you mentioned that women have been instrumental in suggesting a different economic structure. And this specifically, you point to Eleanor Ostrom, who is a Nobel
Uh-huh.
Prize winner, and Kate Raworth. So I'd like you to
Yeah.
just summarize their ideas and show how they fit with an eco-civilization.
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, they're two, in my view, two of the leading thinkers of the sort of core elements of an eco-civilization that I relied on extensively in what I worked on. So Eleanor Ostrom is was basically the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for economics. And what's kind of fascinating is she wasn't actually an economist. And in fact, when she won the Nobel Prize for economics, there was an uproar, and people like were saying, "This is a scandal! Like the economics will never be the same again." All this kind of stuff. Of course, the fact that she was a woman was not even implicit. Some of them were quite explicit about the scandalous nature of that. So she had studied the commons, and to what we've been describing, yeah, I was talking about the work of David Bollier, for example, who's described the commons. He's basically building off her work. Um, and what she discovered is that for hundreds and thousands of years, there have been ways in the middle, again, hidden within these empires and hierarchies and civilizations. There have been groups, significant groups all around the world that actually worked together in self-organized way to husband their resources, to actually be sustainable, and did it in certain ways according to certain principles. And she found principles that were universal, that applied to communities that did this in Japan, in Europe, communities dealing with forests, with fishing, with rivers, with deserts. And she came up with certain principles. And so she developed these principles of the commons. Um, and they were principles such as having clear identity, having power not imposed from outside, but power actually through self-organized means, which is very consistent with our human evolutionary way of how we were as hunter-gatherers. And there were concepts like ratcheted sanctions. So if they saw somebody do something wrong, you didn't like penalize them. You didn't have some calling the police from outside. You basically gave them a little bit of rap on the knuckle or whatever, or, brought them back into shape. And most people go with that because community is important to them. But when people still break the rules, they get bigger and bigger sanctions until ultimately it could be very significant. But the whole point is these are stable communities. Those sanctions are barely ever needed because of the fact that these rules are ongoing. And so you don't have a leader, and they're actually self-organized and designed. So she developed these principles of the commons, and another David Sloan Wilson, who some of you may know is one of the world's leading evolutionary biologists, worked with Eleanor Ostrom to design what he calls principles for pro-social behavior. And that's kind of fundamental to really the whole infrastructure of this book. Those are principles that then can apply to every aspect of how we organize human society. So Eleanor Ostrom really didn't just take these principles, but then applied them to how that could work on what she called polycentric governance, all the way to, you could even imagine global governance, starting from these grassroots self-governance, going all the way up to higher and higher levels. So that's Eleanor Ostrom. And Kate Raworth, meanwhile, did an equally radical job in a different part of economics. So these are both really shook up economics. But what Kate Raworth did, she calls herself a renegade economist. She designed what she call a fundamentally different framework for economics, which she calls donut economics. And I think haven't you studied this at times,
Yes.
Georgia? Um, and well, so anyone who doesn't know, really simply, the outer level of the donut, it's one of those donuts with a hole in the middle, right? As opposed to a jam. And the outer layer essentially correlates to the nine planetary boundaries. I'm sure people are familiar with that Johan Rockström and the Stockholm Resilience Institute have developed over decades to identify things like greenhouse gas emissions or acid in the ocean or ozone layers or things like that that we have to stay within or we're out of our safe operating space for humanity. And we've blown through seven of the nine. So part of what economics is about then is to get us back within those parameters. But the inner part of the donut refers to basically what I was saying about what an eco-civilization is about in the first place, setting the conditions for all humans, in this case, to thrive, which basically means the basic amount of material needs they have, basic housing and health and sanitation and access to clean water and safety, and did I mention education and all of these different things are the basics you need. And when you look at what is within the donut, and that's the sort of goal then of economics, is not to grow GDP in this way that destroys the world, which simply measures not well-being at all, but the rate at which we're sucking wealth into the monetary economy, um, but to actually go within the donut. But when you look at it, you discover there's not a single country actually within the donut right now.
Mm.
But there are some that are close, such as Costa Rica. And so then, as in Kate Raworth's idea, what she says is this kind of redefines what we mean by development. So development doesn't mean the global north telling majority world countries like the sort of we're the grown-ups now you do what we do and then you'll be sort of happy someday. Development actually means getting to within that donut. So for the affluent global north countries, it means reducing the excessive consumption that's blown that away so much. For many countries in the majority world, it means expanding what is needed for basic welfare, which can only come about through shifts in this incredible inequality that we've talked about earlier. So these are two great women thinkers that I'm hugely indebted to.
And me too. I want to open it up to questions if people have questions or, okay, I see Alan. Do you want to go ahead? You can unmute.
Yes. Jeremy, so nice to see you again with Georgia. I bought your book yesterday,
Yeah,
and
great to see you
and
again.
I and there was a post that you put out today, and you mentioned reciprocal causality.
Yeah.
Would you talk about reciprocal causality?
That was one of my
Yeah.
questions too.
Oh, okay,
I beat
sure.
you to
Yeah.
it.
Well, yeah, it's an important concept, and it's important primarily for this conversation in terms of how we actually help to make the movement for change most effective. But reciprocal causality has a deeper meaning. So sort of we only really understand when we go at the sort of the core level of the meaning. And it's a term that comes really from systems biology. And it looks at really how life itself functions, right? So if you go all the way to the beginnings of life on Earth, the first few 100 million years here, where there were these complex molecules that weren't alive, and then suddenly something happened to cause them to become alive. And what biologists have kind of understood is that in the complex molecules became a system as a whole. And as a system as a whole, they began to recognize what was needed in order for that system to stay healthy, to take in energy from outside and keep growing and then regenerate itself, this concept called autopoiesis. And what reciprocal causality refers to is the notion that all the different parts of that initially a complex molecule or any complex system, they do their own things and they create a whole in what they're doing. Meanwhile, the whole, as a whole, actually influences all the different parts. So we can make sense of this when we think of our own bodies. Like I've got my heart cells and my nerve cells and my skin cells, and they're very different in what they do. Very, very different from each other. But they all kind of know intrinsically that they're part of the whole called Jeremy, and they sort of work together. So in this case, I as an organism and the whole affecting the parts, where the parts are so essentially making me what I am. Now, when you apply this to change making, it helps to understand how we can make this movement for change more effective because it's not a matter, there's two extremes where we can sort of go wrong. And there's some movements or some groups over the century, over the decades or whatever, they've gone, we've got the answer. We need to get an orthodoxy. Everyone's got to step in line. And you can look at obviously things like communism as a movement, as an example of doing exactly that, where at certain points you'd be shot if you just broke the party line just a little bit. That's one extreme. The other extreme, oftentimes people in our movement get more into, we so intend to avoid this kind of top-down forcing issues that we say kind of let a thousand flowers bloom. Like everyone should just go their own way. And it's a way in which sometimes people criticize the notion of when I say an eco-civilization, they say, well, forget about the singular. It should be just like multiple cultures, multiple groups doing their thing all around, which is fine. But when they're totally disparate, it's the other extreme. It's almost like it's all the parts, but without a whole. So what reciprocal causality refers to is this notion of there's a certain shared when we think of movements for change, we can think of it as a sort of, I call it a central manifold of meaning that allows everyone to feel unified while everyone does their own unique things. And in that article I just published, is really about the success of neoliberalism. And as I've looked at that, uh, we can really see that neoliberalism itself and the Mont Pelerin Society that instituted this whole movement decades ago accomplished it through reciprocal causality. So the manifold of meaning they had was this notion of individual liberty. So it was one idea that different people could interpret in different ways, but they all had the same. We all know what we're going for. We need to like break, the power of state or break the power of trade unions or whatever it was so we can really focus on individual liberty. And so within that, they might have arguments and debates with each other as to what's the right way to do it, but they all agreed on this kind of shared manifold of meaning. And you see that really with the scientific revolution. They had different scientists working all kind of disparate ways, but they all agreed nature is a machine and we can conquer nature by figuring out how this machine works. And that gave them a sense of meaning, a sense of huge achievement, and which they shared together in what they were doing. We, as a movement, I believe, can do the same thing. And it doesn't have to be the term eco-civilization. To me, that was the sort of a term that meant a lot to me and the one that I've sort of used the label of the book. But that's a bit of a mouthful. There's probably another term somewhere that's waiting to be used. But basically, what we all care about, and I feel everyone in the movement, whether it's indigenous people like following Buen Vivir, or people in sub-Saharan Africa following principles of Uhuru, or any people in these different islands of coherence, what we basically agree on is the core dignity of human life and the core intrinsic value of all of life on this earth. So there's a sense of basically the intrinsic value of life as being fundamental. And that's why we can think of this future as, a more neutral term, as like a life affirming or life enhancing system is what pretty much everyone working in this movement can agree with. And really, the likelihood is that the vast majority of people in this earth today, if they looked at that, would agree that that's something worth fighting for. That's what I want to do. And that could be the shared manifold of meaning, even while different groups pursue that in fundamentally different ways, but sharing these core principles.
Great. Do we have any other questions? If we don't, we'll go back to mine. I'm up for that, but I want to make sure that I don't leave anyone out who might want to ask something or share something. All right. Well, I'm gonna.
Fran, I see Fran put her
Oh,
hand
Fran, did you put your hand up?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, of course, first, I want to be sure everybody sees this book.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you, Fran.
So Dave and I are very happy to have this book, and of course, have appreciated Jeremy's work, and the clarity with which you explain your concepts is stunning. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran.
So you mentioned that ecological civilization, is a term that maybe people pick up on, but maybe they don't. But my question for you is, it's not a random term. It arose, my understanding is it arose in China,
Hmm.
and that it remains a compelling concept there, even though they are also pursuing, the gold mountain as well as the green lush mountain. So I just want you to speak a little bit to the term
Hmm.
and how widespread you see it being picked up,
Yeah.
or is it just something to kind of let go of because it's kind of clunky, has a lot of syllables?
Exactly. It does. And I think that's why the people who came up with the cover of the book, I think they were saying to themselves, like, how do we deal with this horrible term? It's so long. And so I think they broke it up to kind of force people to actually read it through. Oh, what is this word? Oh, okay. Eco-civilization. So it's kind of funny. Um, and well, I love where you're going on this, Fran. And I just want to say, so everyone, just for the record, if you will, it was David who first introduced me to this term when I was really working on the final steps of my last book, The Web of Meaning. And as soon as I heard this term, it just totally came alive for me. And what came alive for me about that term was sort of two things about it. And one was the scope, like the word civilization to me was it captured in this one idea. We're talking about everything needs to change. We're not just talking about change our economics. We're not just talking about, change how we design technology or change our agriculture. Everything has to change. And it's actually only when they all change together that they begin to cohere and help each other to form a fundamentally different system. So that was a huge thing that inspired me. And the ecological part inspired me equally because it gave the sense of what it needs to change too. That we gain our principles from ecosystems, from nature's own principles that have worked for billions of years. Things like mutually beneficial symbiosis, or fractality and fractal flourishing. And these are concepts that we learn from nature that we can apply to our society. So that's why I fell in love with the term and I've dedicated my, everything to it. But I've come across so many people who don't love it.
Hmm.
The last thing I want to do is just sort of get attached to it just for the sake of the term. But to your point about China,
Hmm.
so they've used that, that's really been associated with them way more than anything else. And if you just Google the term, probably the first 10 or 20 or so references you'll get to won't be my book or David's work or anything else, but will be China this and China that and Xi Jinping this and that. Um, and honestly, for me, that was actually a little bit of a issue I had when deciding to go with this term for the book. Well, is it's so embedded in mainstream thinking around China, but I didn't necessarily want to hitch it to that. And the way it's used in China, I feel there's nuance around it. I mean, on the one hand, I feel the simple fact that one of the two most powerful nation states on this earth has actually embraced the vision of ecological civilization and actually uses that as one of its, like you say, one of the two peaks of what the entire society is around, is amazing. And it's a testament to basically Chinese culture. I mean, and there's a lot of ways in which it's very consistent with Taoism and Confucianism going
Hmm.
back thousands of years because they never went through this modernistic way of seeing the world as split and the rest of life as a machine and all this stuff. So it's very consistent with that.
Hmm.
And it's actually a great source of hope that such a powerful nation even embraces that. Having said that, there are ways in which if China were a corporation in the West and they were saying, yeah, we believe in eco-civilization, I'd be one of the first to say greenwashing. Like they're saying it, but they're not doing the do because, China have also established, this Belt and Road Initiative is, something designed to project China's economic power throughout most of the global South. They've done a great job of it. And it's also one of the most extractive and like one of the initiatives in the world that has really extracted resources more than any other. Um, and even while China is absolute world leaders in renewables, they're still using massive amounts of fossil fuel. And I think they're even maybe the number one contributors to greenhouse gas emissions right now. So we have to be aware of that. And one of the core elements of eco-civilization, the way I see it, is subsidiarity, is pushing power down to the lowest level in the system, like that Eleanor Ostrom self-organized commons-based thing. And we have to recognize that the truth is that China is a very centralized, essentially surveillance state, and are the world's leaders in using technology and AI and algorithms to establish surveillance and autocratic power throughout the society. So
Just
there's a lot of nuance around it, is the point. And having said that, there is many, many groups within China that may disagree with even that characterization, say, actually, there's a ton more autonomy than you realize in China. And many groups and university departments and other groups really pushing for true ecological civilization the way we mean it. And so ultimately, it's a very complex issue. I've talked with Mary Evelyn Tucker, who, as some of you may know, is absolutely one of the most prominent people in the world working on that connection with a Chinese thinking, with ecological civilization. And there's a way in which maybe we can explore how this vision of an eco-civilization might just be the way to transcend these barriers that we're existing right now, the sort of China versus US polarization and enmity and all this kind of stuff. And maybe through Western thinkers talking about eco-civilization as as something that applies for all humanity can be a way that we can actually establish really, really meta level links with Chinese thought and with the rest of the world. So eco-civilization could actually truly become a true planet-wide vision. And in fact, right now as we speak, in Tällberg in Sweden, there's this amazing group led by somebody called Göran Karstadt, who's been very involved in this eco-civilization vision in Europe, with about this great conference with about half the people coming from China, half the people coming from the West, talking about the vision of an ecological civilization. So these things may be happening as we speak.
okay, I want to take one last question from Jerry. You need to unmute.
Yep.
Jerry?
Yes. First of all, this is a really uh, great and encouraging kind of conceptualization. I'm trying to envision what a system of governance would look like that would really enable this.
Mm.
And one of the concepts you brought up that seems central to that is polycentric governance.
Hmm.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that. And well, with an eye on the time, I could talk for a good 10 minutes. So I'll just have to give you the very high level summary of it. But absolutely it's central. And I've got a couple of chapters of my book on this topic. One has to do with governance, really more like within we might consider a nation state or within some sort of a given society. And another whole chapter looks at the question of planet-wide governance, global governance, and what the issues are and how that would apply. But the fundamental concept is, again, back to this notion of subsidiarity. And rather than, and we're all kind of agreed, we like the idea of democracy. But what the book does is it kind of shows that what we think of as electoral democracy right now is not democracy at all. It's really what we can really better call electoral oligarchy, where we get to choose between one set of oligarchs and power elites versus another, and who's going to rule over us the next 4 or 5 years until the next time we get a day in the polls to choose the other oligarch party or whatever. So you can almost think of it as oligarchy by consent, which has been shown by studies that actually the wealthy get their way with policy decisions and not ordinary people. Um, but there's an alternative, which has been at this point really proven to work incredibly well, which is known as citizens' assemblies, which is a form of deliberative democracy, which brings ordinary people together, chosen by sortition. And the amazing thing is that when they come together, ordinary people, they don't get to each other's throats like in this polarized way in which social media and we think happens from the way people attack each other in the public forum, but they actually start to work together when it's under skillful facilitation, when they're given the time to get to look at issues, when they're able to like respect each other's opinions, when they can bring in experts, and when their views and their recommendations are known to actually have an impact. So they're not just like talking in theory. And these citizens' assemblies come up with far better decisions and ideas than electoral politicians do. So this is a source of absolute hope, and it's really another island of coherence, if you will, of these groups. So I go into that in some detail, and I come up with a basically sort of flesh out a vision. There's a scholar, another great visionary thinking woman called Hélène Landemore, who's written a book called Open Democracy, who goes into this in extreme detail. I've taken her idea and envisioned what would an actual whole society look like with these citizens' assemblies at the local level, going all the way up to a national level. So you would, in the end, you wouldn't even need elected politicians at all. The entire system could work more effectively, way, way better, and at a far more democratic way through that approach. So that's, to me, one of the most exciting, important things for us to get behind.
Just for clarification, you said citizens assembly chosen by, and I missed
Oh, I'm
the
sorry.
next
Yeah,
word.
thank you. The word is sortition, which basically means chosen by lottery. Essentially, the way we choose juries now, where essentially you receive something in the mail saying it's your turn to serve in the jury, and so the point is they're not chosen through some selection process where only the most educated, the most this or that get chosen, but ordinary people. And there's some statistical um, a lot changes done to ensure that small groups that are minority groups that would otherwise be underrepresented achieve proper representation. But other than that, it's basically chosen randomly, which is exactly, by the way, how Athenians chose their governing body way back in the days of Plato and Aristotle. And Aristotle himself drew a distinction between elections, electoral governance, which he literally called oligarchy, and what he said was a true democracy, which was this chosen in those days by you'd like poll a lot, and that's how you decided who was going to govern you, who's make the decisions for the next period of time.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. This has just been an incredible hour. And I know I want to listen to the whole thing again. Yeah, everyone can unmute if you want. We want to applaud you. This has been extraordinary.
was
And you're
wonderful.
holding up your book again,
Thank you,
Echo
Fran. Yeah.
Civilization. Highly recommend it. It's just, it's required reading for, I think, every Praxis member to really understand how the changes we need to go through in the coming years. So I want to thank you. I'm going to stop the recording at this point. I think I am.
Look at the hearts.
That's
That's
what it
good.
did.
I don't know how to do that.
I don't know how to stop the recording. Oh, here we go.